Good morning, and thank you all so much for coming to this event at the New Yorker Festival 2012. I'm George Packer. I am a staff writer at the New Yorker, and it's an honor to be on stage with these people, and I don't say that lightly. This was originally called Left Behind, and someone left that one behind and changed it to Giving Voice, which didn't shed a whole lot more light on it. We're going to talk about the things that interest the people on our panel this morning, and here's who they are. To my immediate left is Geoffrey Canada. He's probably doesn't need to be introduced, but I will anyway. He's the president and the CEO of the Harlem Children's Zone, which provides educational and social services to poor children and their families in an area of central Harlem that began as 24 blocks and is now 97 blocks of Harlem. And it includes two charter schools that he founded, the Promise Academies. He was born and raised in the South Bronx, a little north of the Harlem Children's Zone, educated at Bowdoin and at the Harvard School of Education, and he's the author of two books, autobiography called Fist, Stick, Knife, Gun, A Personal History of Violence in America, and Reaching Up for Manhood, Transforming the Lives of Boys in America. He's also been teaching Taekwondo for 30 years and is the founder of the Changmu Kwan Martial Arts School, and I think he is a third-degree black belt?
Yeah, it's 6th degree now, but who cares?
I'm not messing with you. Let's just put it that way. And second down is Jose Antonio Vargas, who was born in the Philippines about 5 years ago. He's so much younger than the rest of us. No, it was in. He was brought to California, actually very near where I grew up, at age 12. Went to Mountain View High School, which was a rival of my high school.
Which high school did you go to?
Gunn High School.
Oh.
And what did that mean? Now I'm going to have to worry about it. And to San Francisco State. He was brought here at 12 to live with his grandparents. When he was 16 and went to get his driver's license, he found out that he did not have legal papers to be in the United States. He was one of the 11 million undocumented immigrants. He began working for newspapers and websites, most notably the Washington Post, where he wrote about people with HIV in Washington, and then was part of a team that won a Pulitzer for covering the shootings at Virginia Tech. His first piece for our magazine was published in 2010, and it was a profile of Mark Zuckerberg, which was a pretty great way to start out at the New Yorker. And last year, he wrote an essay in the New York Times Magazine, which should have been in the New Yorker, in which he told the story of his life and of how he had been living for about 15 years with the secret of being undocumented and what that meant. And it was a kind of coming out. And since then, he's founded Define American, which tries to change the way Americans talk about immigration. And next down is Professor Abhijit Banerjee. He was born in Calcutta, educated there and in New Delhi, and then received his PhD in economics from Harvard. And he's the Ford Foundation International Professor of Economics at MIT. He co-founded in 2003 the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, which tries to reduce poverty by ensuring that policies are based on scientific evidence, which can be tested in randomized evaluations. And last year, he co-authored with Esther Duflo, Poor Economics, a radical rethinking of the way to fight global poverty, which became kind of an international bestseller, which it doesn't usually happen to books on development economics, and won the Financial Times, Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year award. And finally, Katherine Boo, who's a colleague of mine at the New Yorker, has been actually since the year I arrived, 2003, where she's written about poverty and education and social and economic policy, but always in narrative and intimately narrative form. Before coming to the New Yorker, she wrote for the Post, like Jose, and won a Pulitzer, like Jose. She also has won a MacArthur. Have you won a MacArthur? What's wrong with them?
I don't know what's wrong with that foundation, but I haven't gotten around.
I'd assume there are at least two on this panel. And this year, Kate wrote Behind the Beautiful Forevers, a book about a slum in Mumbai, which is my choice for nonfiction book of the year. So I want to start with the problem of language, almost to get it out of the way, so we can then have an anxiety-free discussion about a vexed subject. I noticed in the debate the other night, the notorious debate, that Mitt Romney at one point talked about poor people, which hasn't happened very often in the campaign on either side. And immediately he caught himself and said lower income, as if he had said homosexual, I mean gay, or Negro, I mean black. It was like he had said something politically incorrect, and so he switched from poor to lower income. And I remember sort of being puzzled by that, like what's wrong with saying poor people? So first, for all of you, and maybe Jeff, you could begin, what, if anything, is wrong about the way we talk about poor people and poverty? And I'm sure that the word poor people is not at the top of the list.
Yeah, I think a number of us here in the States have been worried about the conversation around poverty. Poverty as, I think, a state of economic condition in this country has associated with it lots of, I think, images of poor black and brown folk who probably don't have the right values and attitudes and behaviors. And the fact that poverty is now a national condition that impacts whites and everybody else in this country is something the country hasn't dealt with. So in the Republican primary, you had two candidates both say, African Americans don't want food stamps, I'm going to give them something else. Well, neither one of them understood that there are 47 million Americans on food stamps. They are majority white, overwhelmingly white. In their minds, they thought this was a black issue, right? And that poverty is a national condition is something the country doesn't want to deal with. And so I think that they hide that by trying to use language that doesn't have all of the pejorative impact that we associate welfare queens, sort of the makers and the takers and all of that kind of language, versus that we're in a condition in this country right now that a huge numbers of Americans are poor, and we need to address that issue.
But do you think political people or people in public life are becoming more comfortable with language that demonizes the poor, or are they becoming more euphemistic?
Look, I think that you have not heard folk be honest about the conditions that lots of Americans find themselves in, that the unemployment rates or the reductions are really driven by people who have given up hoping to find a job. It's not something people want to talk about. It's not part of the American sort of way of thinking about these kind of problems. And the issue becomes that I think people think this is a minor issue in an American sort of landscape, and I think it's a major issue. So it's almost decided, just don't mention the word, right? Because if you mention the word, it just is going to make people uncomfortable. And so we'll just pretend that this is not, right now, a fairly national disaster happening in America.
Jose, you told me you had avoided the subject of immigration as a journalist for
like a plague,
for an obvious reason, until you wrote that essay. And since then, that's become your subject, both as a journalist and I guess as an activist. So what is it about the way Americans talk about immigrants that perhaps gets in the way of clear thinking about the subject?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think we have a really big framing problem. I mean, the fact that you even, I don't know if people know this, but 2 weeks ago, I kind of issued a very public challenge to the media, particularly the New York Times and the Associated Press, to stop using the word illegal to refer to people, just because it's really inaccurate and imprecise and really dehumanizing. I mean, can you think of any other instance in which we refer to a group of people as illegal, right? And to me, the fact that most people do that, including the New York Times, is in some ways, it underscores the very simplistic nature in which we understand the issue. I mean, let's think of it this way. In some ways, the word illegal starts and ends the conversation. How do you legalize people who are illegal? That's it. Like, I've been traveling around the country in places like Alabama and Arizona, in places where I really shouldn't be going. And, but, you know, it was fascinating talking and really interviewing people. Like, I did a lot of like Jay Leno, Man in the Street style kind of stuff. And having people just interchangeably say, you know, the Mexicans, you know, those illegals, just kind of in one breath. And of course, you have to stop them and say that, oh, by the way, not all undocumented people are Mexicans. FYI, I'm Filipino. You know, like that kind of stuff, right? And the fact that we have this very brown, we have a very, it's almost as if we've created this border ghetto Mexican thing in our minds. That in some ways really, look, one interesting statistic. Out of the 11 million undocumented people in America, 1 million are fully Asian and Pacific Islander. Out of the 11 million. Do you ever hear about that? No. I was stunned when one of the things people always ask me is, you know, why don't you just make yourself legal? That's like the biggest, that's like that, and like, two is like, what about illegal don't you understand? And why don't you just make yourself legal? To which, of course, I usually answer because I'm a masochist, and this is so much more fun. And if you look at, take that back now to like how we talk about it, right? Like, we talk about illegal immigration in a purely problem-centric framing and never a solution-centric framing. It's always about the problem, never about the solution. And unless we change that, unless we realize that there is no process for people like me to legalize myself, until we actually look at people as human beings, right? I don't think we're going to be able to unpack what this really is. That's why language is at the heart of that. That's why using the word illegal in some ways is really counterproductive and incorrect.
Abhijit, two-part question along these lines. One, do you find that in India or in Southeast Asia or other places that you have studied and written about, there's the same aversion to talking about poor people, to talking about them at all, to calling them by a simple term? And second, among scholars, is there a language or a way of talking about this subject, your subject, that also gets in the way of understanding and of clear thinking about it?
So in the public discourse in India, I think what's interesting is that in some ways, you know, it's not so much that people, I won't say they have an aversion to talking about poor people, but poor people are, but on the other hand, if you read through a newspaper on a given day, there will be it's very likely there will be no stories about poor people. So poor people are not interesting news. They're sort of, they're there, they're not particularly, I don't think there's a sense of denial that exists in this country. It's quite the reverse. They're kind of the furniture. And it's that, but that also populates the entire policy space then, because you think of them as being more or less movable objects, and policy is thinking about, you know, I'm going to hand them this or move them here or do this to them. And I think it's that sense of being if you like, a movable object, which I think characterizes a lot of how the poor are thought about. Less I think this sense that, you know, of fright or, you know, threat, which I think is much more the U.S. perception, or even like a bit the European perception, you know, of the suburbia of Paris, you know, the sense that the dangerous people live out there. That's not that, at least. Now, there's lots of variation. Brazil and South Africa are much more like the U.S. than India or Kenya.
You mean the poor are more out of sight?
And more of a threat. I think that there is a range there. But I think it's clear that there's, at least in India, they're not seen as a threat. They're seen as some things that we have to deal with.
But so much of your research is about breaking down easy generalizations and looking at particular cases and finding scientific evidence for why, for example, this population might not be using mosquito nets that have been given to them. So do you yourself find yourself sort of trying to avoid encompassing terms like the poor because it might hide the evidence that you find in your research?
Actually, we embrace the term the poor because we found it less dishonest than all the other terms. I mean, there's a sense in which you have to somehow deal with the fact that there's something common about these people. And what we were interested in was precisely the universality of that. So we were very much embracing the term. I think other terms, they exist, like, the marginalized, but, marginalized by whom? I mean, it's not that, 85% of the population will be marginalized. They're sort of there, I mean, so
it's a big margin.
Yeah.
And Kate, your book and your journalism also has an aversion, I'd say, to generalization. You find the particulars, and there's an implied truth behind it, but I don't read you, and certainly not in Behind the Beautiful Forevers, talking generally about poverty and policy about poverty. So what? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, one of the things that animates my work is that I feel that these issues of poverty and development and the effects of inequality are some of the most over-theorized and underreported issues of our time. And part of the problem is that it is difficult to go into communities and spend a great deal of time with people and understand their lives. It's much, much easier to interview a public official and go and do a drive-by, in a housing project or a slum and come away and say that's what people feel. But one of the things that really frustrates me about the way that we talk about poverty is we have this whole language, and it's people are stuck in poverty and people are mired in poverty. It's this still, static language, but the truth is, whether it's in the United States or in India, you've got capital winging around the planet, the experience of poverty is extremely volatile. And this great kid named Norberto, who I spent time with in Denver several years ago, said this thing to me. He said, I don't get this phrase, my family can't get ahead, because my family gets ahead all the time. And then somebody gets sick or the car breaks, and then we slip back down. It's the same everywhere I go. It's not, and to not to acknowledge how volatile that is really to underestimate the stress that places on families and communities and societies as a whole.
Abhijit, since you began to do this work with the Poverty Action Lab, what among the assumptions you might have brought to it, or the assumptions we all bring to it, has been completely shattered? What is the biggest?
Pick my top 5.
Sure, take 5.
Things, I think I started as someone who kind of had had 2 lives. I grew up next to a slum in India, and I was trained in mainstream economics, and those things were essentially, 2 entirely parallel universes in my head. And it was sort of when I started to realize that I actually need to make sense of both. And once you start doing that, then a lot of what happens is that the sort of the presumptions of mainstream economics have to give way, and a lot of way. And so if I were to pick one, I would say I think we have very little understanding of the psychological state of poor people. That is to say, what it means to be I think Kate said it exactly right, this idea of the stress of being poor, and what consequences of being permanently under stress, and permanently trying to think that, if I have to remember to get the water, there's only 45 minutes when the water comes, I will fill up 6 buckets, run back, then I have to make sure that my daughter goes off to school because her school starts early, and then get back and quickly get firewood so that, I can, because people go picking firewood and I will run out, and then I have to come back, and then I have to start the fire, and and by that time my mother-in-law who's sick is going to need her medicine, and just this amount of, just the number of balls you have to keep in the air. And I think once you take that into account, a lot of why the poor behave in potentially different ways from other people just make a lot more sense. Just the degree
What do you mean by different ways?
So, so for example, an example that we often give is of a man who met in Morocco, and he was explaining, we went to his house and we were standing outside, and he was, what would you want to do if you had a little bit more money? And he said, oh, I want to buy some food. And we asked him, and if you had a little bit more, even more money, I said, oh, I would want to buy food. And so we sort of thought that, this guy is really hungry. So then we go into his house, and there is a television, a parabolic antenna, and a DVD player in there. And so my first reaction, this is sort of your economics training. Why haven't you bought the food then? But in fact, he was very clear. He said television is much more important than food. And I think the thing about that, which we forget, is poor people have to live their lives. They're not sort of, I think we think of it in more of delayed gratification always. We say, you're poor, you just need to solve your problem. Then once you become non-poor, then you can go and buy your TV. This guy knows that he's going to be poor all his life. And he wants something other than, eating, whatever, boiled grains. So he wants some pleasure. And if that means you starve sometimes, you starve sometimes. I think pleasure, the need for pleasure in a very stressful, deprived existence is something we, as economists, never really accept. But pleasure is extraordinarily important in understanding how people behave, in real people in real circumstances.
And Jeff, you grew up not next to a slum, but in a slum, if I can use that word, and then you devoted your career to working with people who lived in the kind of place that you grew up. Were there any surprises once you began to work with them, or had your own childhood and youth given you a complete education in what they were up against?
Well, this is what happened, and I just can't agree more about the impact of poverty and stress on your ability to make decisions which other folk look at and say, well, why did you do that? And they'll write about it, have theories, but they don't have a clue about all of the underlying dynamics that go into that. But let me, when I finished graduate school, I started working in Boston. And I started working in, and this was during when Boston was going through desegregation. It was a very complicated time. And I ended up working in a school, a high school, that the kids from the traditional public schools had been kicked out. And this was mostly kids from who were on the front lines as shock troops during the busing crisis. These were the kids throwing the bricks at the black kids on the bus. And I was sort of their first black teacher, and I described my first day teaching in that classroom as the teacher's equivalent of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, right? It was just like the kids took one look at me and they said, we didn't bargain for this.
Except they weren't Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, right?
But this is what I saw, and it really stunned me. Those kids saw the world the same way as the black kids saw the world where I grew up. And I had never been around white, poor kids in my entire life because I grew up in the South Bronx. It was all segregated. I went to Bowdoin. There weren't a lot of poor white kids at Bowdoin. There weren't a lot of poor white kids at Harvard. And so I had this image, right? I had this image of what it meant to be white.
They're all doing okay.
Right? That when the reality of these kids and talking with them in no time at all, even these kids who were racist and everything, they realized I had so much more in common with them than the teachers and the other folks because of my experience of poverty. I actually understood what it felt to feel marginalized and not be able to leave your community, to think everybody's talking about you everywhere you go, to feel hopeless, right? And to do things that we always say, well, why would you do that? Why would you risk your whole life? Because whole for us and whole for them were two totally different things. And so this idea that there was something about poverty which was universal, that often it was described and understood by race, was something that back in the 70s I said, wait a second, we got an issue here going on. So this is what has surprised me, I think, in doing the work I'm doing now, is that the resistance to dealing with solutions that suggest adults have to do something different, right, to be successful with these young people, I find just stunning. I just simply thought there were no solutions. And then if you have solutions, I thought everybody would say, great, let's do that, let's fix this. The commitment to fix the issues and deal with this issue seriously in this country, I think, is something that even today I find shocking, because quite honestly, I think it undermines our democracy in lots of ways that are important, right? And this is not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's none of that stuff. Having a society based on equal access, fairness, a level playing field is something that I think we risk when we have huge numbers of young people growing up outside of that system.
And doesn't it also challenge the sort of a fundamental belief most Americans grow up with, which is that any individual can make it if they work hard enough?
I think that Americans believe that, and when you get to the places that it is clear that that is not true, you find out that there are really a couple of different kinds of America sort of going on. And I think one of the reasons that Americans don't understand this is that you can basically live your life as a caring, sensitive person and never experience what it's like to really interact with poor people. And it's not because you've done anything wrong, it's because we have isolated this problem and marginalized it to the place that unless you intentionally go out and live in a Mumbai slum, you are just not going to come in contact with folk in a way that helps you understand some of the challenges that they're dealing with. And so I think that, we have sort of allowed this to happen away from us and don't feel like this problem is as big as it is.
Well, in a way, in this country, everything is left and right today. And poverty, the left says not enough money, not enough jobs. The right says not enough good behavior, not enough family values. So I'm wondering what all of you...
I don't agree with that for this reason.
With which?
With the left. I agree with you with the right. I don't agree with you with the left. I think the left has also been saying, this is really about a set of values and standards and other issues. And I've been worried that the left has moved much closer to the right in thinking about poverty. And we're supposed to understand when they use these code words that they're really talking about poverty, but they're not going to talk about poverty.
Well, when did that happen? Because, William Julius Wilson sort of set the marker for the idea that when jobs disappear, poverty is what follows. And that is a more economic view. So do you think more recently the left has sort of embraced the cultural and the psychological and the moral?
I think, look, you and I both think Bill Wilson's work was seminal, was important, it laid out. I don't find most folk really both know the work or understand what he was talking about, right? And so I don't think that penetrated very deeply into the American understanding about how the lack of access to jobs really changes the whole dynamics in a community and family. People have still ascribing these issues to values and social issues versus the big economic challenges that families face when men can't work, right? And not for a year or two, but for decades, and what happens to the family structure and all of those other kinds of things. So I don't think we've ever accepted Bill Wilson's understanding of some of these dynamics.
Okay. I want to shift a bit here and ask both Jose and Kate to talk about writing about poor people, writing about immigrants, which are not exactly the same thing, although in this country undocumented immigrants tend to be pretty poor. And you both have a background in journalism, but I think you've kind of moved in different directions. Kate, you never appear in your work. There's like, wait, you were at the bus stop with the black woman in Oklahoma City who could not flag down the bus. Did you try? With Kim, I can imagine you kind of hiding behind a tree so that you wouldn't affect, the outcome of the story.
A tree was involved, in fact.
In Behind the Beautiful Forevers, this marvelous account that feels, in every good sense, like you're reading fiction of the lives of people whose languages you couldn't speak. What about the blonde woman who kept walking into the slum every morning and staying there all day? What effect did she have? You wrote a very eloquent author's note explaining why you're not there. Jose, you have kind of stepped forward and said, this is actually my story.
Very
not only am I going to...
I should say.
Sorry?
Very uncomfortably.
Why?
Because I grew up, everything I learned about journalism, I learned from reading. I wasn't a journalism major at all. I wasn't even supposed to go to college. So like the New Yorker has been kind of my Bible in that way. And when I got to the Post, Katherine Boo's, most of her articles, especially in the Washington Post magazine, I was like, in some ways, I don't want to embarrass, because Kate's sitting right here, but I literally would just read them, religiously, to learn how to not be invisible, but to learn how to create that space in which, people can be specific and universal at the same time, right? And when I came out and started, for me as a writer, the three most dangerous words are I, me, and my. Yeah. And now that I'm a year and a half into this, that's the space that I'm occupying. It's very uncomfortable for me. And I still find myself, thank God for James Baldwin and Joan Didion. I do a lot of just I get lost, I pick up Notes of Native Son, and I just start flipping. I'm like, okay, that's the language. Just to get myself oriented that way, because that's not where I come from. That hasn't been where I learned.
The language of essay writing.
The language of essay writing, and I feel like I've gone to this new thing in which I have to earn the right to say I. Does that make sense? I have to justify that this isn't self-serving, that I'm speaking to the greater truth.
Is part of the uncomfortableness that you have a strong view about the subject, and in fact you're trying to push the conversation and maybe even the policy in a certain direction while you're covering it?
And look, I am not privileged enough to be a Democrat or Republican. I've never voted. I can't. And in some ways, as somebody who's Filipino, who's undocumented, who's gay, I've never been privileged enough to be objective. I always come from a point of view. But as a journalist, I think the training has always been, I remember when I was covering the 2008 election and going to Ohio to follow Sarah Palin and interviewing people who really truly believed that Obama was Muslim and sitting down with them in front of Google as they Obama, Muslim, here are the sources. And you're like, wait up a second, so you don't trust the Washington Post and the New York Times and PolitiFact. No, we don't trust that. They read this other stuff. And to sit there and why are you coming from that point of view? And then taking it now to this work, which is sitting down with very anxious, angry, working class, poor white people who want someone to blame, who need someone to blame. And now they've turned to...
You're a pretty juicy target.
And I'm standing there right in front of them, and I'm like, sir, my life, I am not a threat to you. We live in the same country. This is the big thing that I like to talk about people is so there are about 2 million undocumented young people in this country, what we call dreamers, undocumented youth. We can't all serve you drinks and babysit your kids and mow your lawns. What do you want to do with us? And when we were in Alabama last year, I'm going back again later this month, Alabama actually out Arizona. Alabama has the worst immigration law in the country. Is it the irony? Here we are, being in Birmingham for about a few days. I'm going back again later this month. You would think, by the way people that I interviewed in Birmingham, that you would think that J-Lo had encamped in the middle of town the way they talked about Hispanics, as if they're everywhere. Birmingham is 5% Hispanic, right? And yet they've created this idea that there they are at Walmart speaking Spanish. I remember this one guy telling me, I don't understand why they all have to live in the same house. I'm like, what? I drove past this house and there's like 7 cars. I'm like, why are you driving by the house? I'm telling you, like, if we do not address kind of, back to what you were saying here, if we do not address this white working class anxiety and try to unpack where that's coming from, and the fact that they've been mostly invisible in the coverage of poverty, right? I think we are in for a very uncomfortable couple of decades.
Kate, have you ever wanted to write essays or op-eds? Have you ever wanted to take all the reporting you've done over the years and turn it into a diatribe or a proposal, how?
Well, for me, it's I have bad hands and I have some medical issues, and so for me, it's always a question of what can I do that everybody else isn't doing? Because what's the point? I don't, if I can only have a limited amount of time and effort to invest, am I going to choose the thing that I think that's most important? And so I choose the things that, I choose to spend long periods of time with low-income people and listen to them and try to bring that to the public. I suppose also it's just, it's something that I think that I can do pretty well, where, you're much better at writing notes and comments. But the other thing that I think is that, like with why I keep myself out of my work, there are many, many reasons, and I have all these alternate books in my head that are, and graphic novels and, and humiliating comics of my experience as a reporter. But I feel like that when you're writing about, the issues that I care about most aren't necessarily things that people just wake up in the morning, like, dying to read. And you have a very limited amount of space that the reading public is going to give you. And so my hope is to bring I don't want to be the broker in the middle of the book saying, look at this nice boy named Abdul who sorts garbage and supports a family of 11, on things that other people throw away. I want you to meet Abdul directly. I want you to make your own judge. I want to use the limited space that I have allotted to me to bring you closer to this person who you ordinarily wouldn't meet. Because I can sit on a stage and I can tell you what I think about it, who I am. But he's not on the stage.
But is there a point of view? Is there an implied argument in Behind the Beautiful Forever?
I think it's that my values inform what I choose to write about. But when I'm reporting, I try to write what I see.
Do you worry that people read about the poor in the way they might give a quarter to someone on the subway? In other words, it's sort of an act of self-cleansing, and then they can move on and read about J-Lo, or, you know what I'm asking?
Yeah. Does
people read your work, but
reading a book inoculate them from doing something? Well, for me, it's always the question of, is it better than nothing? Like, if a few people are going to read my book, or I love Poor Economics, and that few people are going to read that and start thinking, now really, what can I do? And if what can I, what small thing can I contribute to this fairness equation? And there are, you can never control how your book is going to be read.
How was it read in Anawati, or was it?
It was read, and by the people who could read English, and then they talked about it. I got good reviews in Anawati, in fact. Actually, the best review I ever got in my life came from a young woman named Manju. If anybody's read the book, she's in it. And newspaper reporters came there, and they said, do these people really exist? Did this happen? They did some fact-checking after the fact, and she said, what she wrote is what I am. And I was really honored by that.
Abhijit, what role, if any, does the kind of work Kate does play in your work? Do you turn to narrative journalism for insight, or is it kind of a separate way of looking at this, and what you're looking at is based on tests and studies?
Oh, absolutely. Just to go back to your question to Kate before, I think nobody could read Kate's book for expansion. I think it drags you through the mud for so long, and with such compulsion that you could never read it just to get it out of the system. It's a book that doesn't leave you alone.
It stays in your system.
And I think that, I mean, for me, I think what's very important about books like Kate's, but other books I've read, George Orwell is my hero. And so I've probably read Road to Wigan Pier and Down and Out in Paris and London 5 times in the last, before I wrote the book. I read them over and over and over again. And in some sense, what I find very powerful about those narratives is that they give a psychological reality to, what as academics, especially social scientists, our real weakness is that, we can build a story, but then we can't really fill in the characters in the story. So we can sort of build a stage, we can put some cardboard characters on it, but then we can't get them to move. And what happens is, when you have someone like Kate writing, is that you see how to think about the way they would move on the stage, if you like. So it's a very helpful. It's extremely important, because in some ways then you can sort of go back and think about, okay, if that's the right story, then what do I do about it? And I think narratives are very important. In a sense, almost for me, the only reason I was happy that I wrote Poor Economics is that it allowed me to create a narrative for myself. There was stuff I knew, as a profession we kind of knew, but knowing something and putting them into a narrative is very different. And once you have a narrative, the narrative has a life of its own. I don't need to tell you this, you're a writer.
But I'm interested in that narrative. Can you say a few words about how it became a story, and how that story became coherent for you as you wrote the book? Because you're looking at countries all over the world, and it seems like your process is to look at them distinctly rather than as part of the same story.
So I think all good academic work is, studies one thing, studies it in a great deal of depth, and, we try to do careful academic work. That's what I get paid for. And I think we understand little bits of, how one thing, how do you get people to get their children immunized? And I think that's a kind of problem we study. We get some insights into it. And what's difficult is to take many instances like that and turn it into something that will then give you an insight into other things, not immunization, but how schools would work. And that shift is what we're looking for. So in a sense, it's, if you actually, so this, what I was trying to say right at the beginning, that this idea that of understanding a lot of the behavior of the poor in terms of the need for a space for pleasure, a need for a way to manage stress. This is a narrative that came, in a sense, out of just staring at the study and say, what are they telling me? And how can I make sense of all of them? There are lots, the whole book is like, half a page about this study and half a page about that study, but then somehow it has to come together. That exercise is useful.
I feel like you just described the Harlem Children's Zone as well, when you talked about school and healthcare and all the other things that go into the lives of the poor and the ways of trying to reach them. Jeff, do you read either academic or journalistic work about your subject, about yourself? I mean, some of the best writing on poverty has been about Harlem Children's Zone in this country in the last, Paul Tufts' work, for example. So is it helpful to you, or is it annoying?
Paul is, what's interesting, Paul is a gifted writer, and I am constantly trying to keep abreast of sort of the best programmatic and scientific breakthroughs in our field, which is where I spend a lot of my time. But I spend as much time reading the Wall Street Journal and the business section of the Times, because to me, this stuff is all connected. And I keep thinking in this country that people keep trying to pull this stuff apart. There is as best I can figure out.
In what way?
There is a shift in the economic model here in the United States. It is both being driven by technology and globalization in ways that people are just totally disconnected from. And so when I was first starting my career, you could define success by getting a kid a high school diploma. Because if you looked at the outcomes for kids who had a high school diploma, they were so much better. So that was what you needed to do. Today, no one knows what you're going to do with a kid with a high school diploma. That has changed. Those jobs have gone. The skill levels have increased so dramatically, but the system is still acting like that's the benchmark and we can meet that benchmark and kids will be fine. So part of
That's why you said before that the test of success for what you do is graduating from college.
You got to graduate from college.
Right.
Now there's a group of folk who argue against that. College is not for everybody. And the only problem I've ever had with that, and some of them are academic scholars and others, if you ask them, is college for your child, they would say, of course. And I've never heard one of them say college is not for my child. Everybody is really about my kids, right? That's really what they mean. And I tell folk, when in doubt, do what rich people do, right? I've never met a rich person who did not think college was a minimum requirement for their child, right? So this idea of, how you have a set of values, because obviously whatever your target is, right, you're going to hopefully get somewhere around a normal curve on that target, right? Most of the kids will get there, some won't. But if you set the target so low that by setting the target you have defined failure, well, obviously you know what you're going to end up with, most of the kids failing. And that's where I think we've developed these systems. So I think that if we refuse to deal with the fact that the target level has moved up, then the mediocre response we have to lousy schools and tepid economic reforms will continue in this country because people feel like, well, it's not that big a deal. I think it's a huge deal, and we've got to sort of wake America up about that.
Abhijit, your work is overseas, but I'm sure you know a fair amount about what Jeff does and others in this country. So I'm just wondering, his approach, which is integrated, which is about creating a web that sort of encompasses the whole of this community, how would you test it? How would you set up a test for its success or its efficacy, just to understand your method?
So, I mean, there is actually a test of Jeff's work. My friend Roland Fryer has been working with them for many years, and Roland has studied, for example, there was a lottery, I think, for kids who wanted to get into the Harlem, what's it called?
Children's Zone.
Children's Zone.
Yep.
And the lottery, what's nice about a lottery is that, if you win the lottery, you're no different, except for the fact that you won it, from the ones who lost the lottery. And as a result, if you track those kids, the ones who got in and didn't get in, and look at the difference, then you see what happened. And he finds enormous differences in their lives. So I think that there is, and that's sort of how you would test it. Now, there's other things there that are more complicated, which embrace the entire community. Now, of course, that's much harder to test because, there is no second Jeff. And that's sort of what makes it much harder to test. I mean, there is no replication of that. So you can certainly test the effect of individual kids. Can you test there's another 97 blocks somewhere in an extraordinarily poor part of a very rich country which you could compare with it? No. Where there's a guy who also has a 6-degree black belt in Taekwondo. I mean, this is not, it doesn't, that's a bit...
And writes really well.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's a bit of more of a challenge.
Well,
Can I just
Yeah.
Because I just on this research, and Roland is a real researcher, and they're doing a second iteration of the work, and I think it's going to be really exciting, some of the stuff they're finding. But you're right about the ability to test whether or not these other supports and services we're doing are providing a meaningful, measurable impact for young people. And I said it to Roland, and I say it to other folk, but who cares? Because we know, if anyone who's had a child, if you said, do you think it matters if a bunch of kids are going to beat your child up and someone walks that child past those kids and allows them to be safe? Do you think that's going to help with their geometry score? And you would say, who cares? Who would let a child, right, in America experience that simply because we can't figure out how to test or measure? And some of this
is a moral imperative.
You know what? The part of the challenge is, so great, I'm glad the numbers and the academic stuff are reasonable and measurable, but people have said, so why do you do that other stuff? And you do the other stuff because we're Americans, we care about our children, and we know better than to allow children to grow up thinking that this is not one society, thinking that they are illegal, thinking that we are holding something against them, right, just because of where they live. And I think that to the degree that this country understands that our children are really the future of this country, and people at my age are not going to be the ones who are going to be leading America in 15 years. And it's probably going to be many children who are black and brown. If you just look at the demographics in this country, I think that we have to say, what kind of world did we leave these kids? What sense of values? Because they're not only going to be leading this country, there's a chance they're going to be leading in the rest of the world. And so part of this is I think we should absolutely measure some things. But some of the stuff we're doing, I think, just falls underneath human decency and how we treat our children. And that's the part that I want to make sure that people understand. While I think it makes a difference, I'm not doing it because I think that's what'll make a difference. You just won't let kids suffer and be fearful and intimidated and feel hopeless and then say, but if I teach them algebra, they're going to be able to go to college. I just don't think that that's the way you want to have a country and say that it's an equal country, right? Because I know there's a bunch of other kids only 20 blocks away from my zone that aren't dealing with any of these things, and my kids are going to have to compete with them, right? And if anybody thinks that's a level playing field, I know some apartments you can move into and switch with my kids and put them in your apartment, right? We know as parents and human beings, we know the power of community and institutions on young people, and so I don't think we have to measure that.
You know, I was at the Tampa convention, and there weren't very many things said there that would have echoed very well with this group, but one thing that Condi Rice did say, and it kind of got a deafening silence, was, if I know from your zip code whether you're going to get a good education or not, then it's really not possible to speak of equal opportunity. That was so against the message of the convention and really of politics in this country that it kind of baffled the delegates. But Abhijit, use the word replicate, and your work is sort of pushes against our tendency to want there to be a solution that can be applied everywhere, because a solution that worked in this community or in this slum or in this village in this way with these very small adjustments in how services are delivered might not work if people aren't delivering the services in that way, or if the expectations are different, or if you haven't figured out exactly why people are refusing this offered help. I think one problem with the way poverty is talked about and is addressed is the deep frustration that comes with finding out that there is no single solution, when what we want is to be able to say, there, got it. And I'm wondering, Jeff, if you worry that, Harlem Children's Zone became the basis for a big federal program when President Obama took office. I think it hasn't been funded to the extent that he wanted it to be, but it's still tried to do in other neighborhoods what you've done. Do you worry, and you're Superman in the documentary of that title, so do you worry that we want you to be the answer and that you're just not going to be the answer because Youngstown is not the same as Central Harlem?
And we talk about broad principles and not programmatic responses. And we did that with the feds. We also said to the Obama administration that we did not want this funded 100% with government dollars, that we wanted local buy-in, because I was afraid of the accountability issue, right? That if it's a political program, then it has to be successful, even if it's failing, because people have to run for re-election. But if a private individuals give money, they actually are not going to keep funding something that fails. And so this idea of accountability, I think, is, you know, and now look, this is sad. In my business, this is considered revolutionary, that you should hold people accountable if you give them the money, right? that in the end, if they don't deliver, you take the money back. So when we started the Harlem Children's Zone, I started my schools, I said to Mayor Bloomberg and the Chancellor Klein and my board, if in 5 years I have not created a better school than the public schools in Harlem that have been there in 50 years, I'm going to fire myself, right? And everybody, they wrote it down, they were just going to fire themselves. But then I told all my staff, they did because the clock is ticking. You know, I told all my staff, but you all know I'm the last one leaving. So the idea that, right, the idea that you can let kids fail, right, and there's no penalty for failure is only accepted in education and social services. And every place else, if a business fails, the business has to close. People leave their jobs. People work weekends and summers and everything else to be successful. So this seems radical. People hate me for saying these kind of things, that we should, if we have to work summers, we work summers to educate our kids. That's our job. That's what we get paid for. That's what we have to do. Hold us accountable for this. We have been part of the idea of the zone is to bring these very, very basic, I think, business solutions, right, to some of this work. And people think it's radical. It's not radical. The system is absolutely resistant to changing at all, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is our zone is sort of like a good emergency room, right? So all over America, you go into any city, people know great emergency rooms and they know places. You say, if I have a heart attack, do not take me there, because you know what the data says. So what is an emergency room? You have to be able to be nimble enough to have top people who can deal with a variety. You don't know what's walking in the door, right? And if it's a heart attack, you got to have somebody. And if it's a gunshot, well, creating a zone requires the same set of skills as running a good emergency.
So you need really talented people.
You need talented people, but no one's given up on emergency rooms because some of them are lousy, right? To say we don't need an emergency room. We think that's the issue here. Yes, could you have some that'll be lousy? Probably. Yep, probably. But the concept of being able to go into a community, respond to the issues, deliver a set of services that has clear outcomes and reach those outcomes. There are places around the country that absolutely can do those.
Jose, could you snap your fingers and find a solution to the problem of the 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country? Is there, I mean, what would you, if you were king, what would you do about it?
If I had papers? Oh, I'm sorry. If I were
Beyond papers, if you had powers, what would you do?
I just don't think we've had, I think the conversation has been so limited. And I mean, that's why even in the essay, in my quote unquote coming out essay, you know, as far as I was concerned, what made the essay powerful, such as it was really the story of my high school principal and my high school superintendent and this editor at the Washington Post, Peter Pearl, who ended up, Peter Pearl was the guy, I got to the Post 2004, 5 months into it, you know, living in D.C., for somebody like me, I felt like I had illegal like tattooed on my forehead, and I lived like a few blocks from like the Washington Monument, and it felt like it was poking me the entire time. Like it was just like surreal being in D.C. and being in the situation, and I had to tell somebody. So I told this guy, Peter Pearl, who's an editor there, and I expected Peter Pearl to say, all right, we got to report you now. We got to go to the editor and HR and like fix this. I was prepared for that. What he said instead was, first thing, you make so much more sense, because I guess I was always so tightly wound up. Second thing, it's now our shared problem. Don't tell anybody else. Can you imagine how many other Peter Pearls are sitting right now across the country who are helping engineers, accountants, students? We don't hear about them. We don't hear about, if we teamed up, every undocumented youth in this country has a teacher or a principal. One of the best stories, I was interviewing this kid, he's not really a kid, he's 23, 5 weeks, about a month ago now, Korean kid, who can't drive because he doesn't have a license, and so he has to, his pastor was the one who bought him a bike so he can go to school. I'm like, I want to talk to that pastor. I want America to hear from that pastor. When I was in Alabama, I interviewed a guy named U.W. Clement. He was the first African-American appointed to the federal judge, serve federal judge in the state of Alabama. And he has done enough talking among the activists that he actually said to us that, because of this law in Alabama, the Hispanic man is the new Negro. Sir, can you please get on television and say that? I want this issue. You do not have to be Hispanic or Asian to talk about immigration in America. And unless we insist that white people and black people, among everybody else, has a role. I mean, let's look at the civil rights movement, right? It wasn't until white people started saying, wait up a second, that's my brother, that's my sister, right? It wasn't until straight people, right? To me, Will and Grace was a really interesting cultural tipping point in which all of a sudden it wasn't just about Will, it became about Grace. Everybody has a gay roommate, everyone has a gay brother or a gay sister. How do we take that, that kind of concept and take it to immigration and say, you know us. We are completely integrated in this country. We are invisibly visible. And unless we as a society is actually willing to talk about that and unpack that and talk about race and talk about class. One last anecdote. I was in the University of Georgia in Athens, which I didn't know was such a conservative university. I came like a college Republican kind of an event. And we ended up talking, and the college president ended up a little bit interrogating me, which was great. And at one point I said to him, remember that time between 1892 to like 1956 when 12 million undocumented white people from Europe crossed the border called the Atlantic Ocean and landed on Ellis Island without papers? And he was like, what are you talking about? I mean, let's talk about that. Unless you're African American or Native American, we all came here from somewhere. And so I was like, so where are you from? And he's like, I'm American. Where are you from? I'm white. White is not a country. Where are you from? I don't know. Can you find out and then we'll talk about it?
One more question, and then we're going to set up mics and have your questions. So be prepared with them, and maybe we can get microphones set up at the foot of each aisle here. Kate, you're the one person among the four of you who has talked to poor people, written about poor people, studied poor people in the U.S. and overseas. Is it the same? Is it? Can you generalize? Can you universalize? Is it radically different? Are we having two different conversations here?
Well, what's different is obvious, and what strikes me is the same. And one of the things we were talking earlier about the psychological effect of being poor. One of the things that I've seen change so much in the 25 years that I've been doing this kind of work is the way in which inequality and juxtaposed inequality and the ability of poor people, because of television media, to understand what it looks like on the other side, the kind of deep self-loathing that happens, and so it's not just that people with power ignore the poor. Even the poor don't want, they don't even want to be in that club, and so they, and in some ways they're hidden to each other as much as they're hidden to the rest of us. And in my book, I talk about this teenager named Murchie, who describes the slum, which is surrounded by luxury hotels, and he says, everything around us is roses, and we're the shit in between. And if that doesn't tell you the way that people are looking at their own communities, this time, nothing does. And I hear it over and over again in wherever I go, in the United States, in Europe, in the UK, in India, that more and more people feel this added burden of being ashamed of their position relative to the immense wealth.
Do you think you'd find that in a village in rural India? I mean, is this about globalization and about the modern world and about what they know people say about them and how they see themselves in relation to the people getting out at the airport?
Well, right now, even remote Indian villages have televisions too. So, really, for more than ever in human history, is this, do people who have nothing have a sense of the contours of wealth? And that's a very interesting thing. And you would think that would create for some incredibly bloody insurrections, but But in America and so many other places, what's really interesting to me is the way that those internal contradictions are resolved. And why so many of these unequal societies don't actually implode. And I think that has to do in part by the way that poor people turn against each other and against themselves internally.
You must have some questions for these four incredible people. I don't see anyone at a mic yet, but if you could line up at the mics, we will get your questions. Yeah.
Someone once said, "The poor you will always have with you." And my question is, how important is it to those of us who have money to have others who are poor? Because I agree with you about the two parties. Almost anyone could have said, you don't really care about the 47%.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, look,
I'm kidding.
Well, look, some of this is a culture that has glorified both consumption and possession to a level that I don't think, and it's global. And I have young people who feel poor if they don't have a Rolex, right? They forget having a watch, right? Because but this idea that watch has the watch is actually a status of how poor you are versus the ability to think about, I think, this sort of glorification of, these expensive trappings. So now when I was growing up, there were no luxury jeans. There were just dungarees. Now, right? And everybody wore dungarees. And now you have class status based on brands and other things. So I can find kids who feel poor while they're wearing $600 worth of clothing, right? And you just look and say, well, how is that happening? And part of it is, I think, a glorification of consumption. And when you listen to our political leaders saying, go borrow and spend, right, and buy more of this stuff, it's not hard to understand how folk sort of get into this idea that it's really, you are what your worth is really something that has to be visible to the outside world. And I think that that's a real problem. And I think it drives this sense among folk that this is really about what you own versus who you are. And I think the poor are just as amenable to that set of beliefs as anyone else.
I just happened to be watching the Carter Melez speech the other day on YouTube. This is how I spend my afternoons. And it's an incredible speech if you watch it. And in it, he denounced consumption and self-indulgence. And we all know what happened to Jimmy Carter. I don't think any president or anyone who aspires to leadership is going to talk in that way in our country today. So over here.
One of the values of Kate's work and Jose's work is seeing the uniqueness of individuals and understanding how complex the situations are. But ultimately, policy is a really blunt instrument. And so I'm wondering how, once we've understood the complexity and the individuality of it, how do we think about policy when, for instance, the average impact of microcredit is 0? How should we think about a policy with low average impact? But it obviously does help some people, and the situations are really complex.
Well, I think Kate and Abhijit should answer that question.
Microfinance is a really interesting example, and one of the ways in which when you're reporting from the so-called ground, so-called field, part of what you're trying to do in your own mind, or what I am anyway, is to have a conversation with the policymakers and the people, the philanthropists who have the resources to actually change the world. And part of what good policymakers want is an understanding of how good intentions at the top get subverted before they get to the poor people's side of the street. And in the Anawati and in many other places that I looked at in India, microfinance was being used by the slightly better off people in poor communities to further exploit the worst off people in those communities. And that doesn't mean that microfinance is worthless. What it means is that you need to know what's happening in these communities so that you can begin to think about how to make the system less easily gamed. I mean, and I see that over and over again in this country and in wherever I go, is that so often it's not really a matter of, it's not about malign intentions. It's about the fact that we don't take anti-poverty strategy seriously enough to hold, to get it right and to you're talking about accountability for Harlem Children's Growth, and it's the same thing. It's like it exists mainly for people on podiums to talk about the program they're sponsoring than it is to actually think about how it's enacted on the ground.
Yeah, so I think you exactly agree with what Kate said, but just to add to that, I think that I think the point about complexity is not that we could not think of policies that we would pursue, but that we need to recognize that we can't just impose a structure and assume that it is going to go that way. So it's not. I think a nice example of that is, there's almost a mechanical equation of the poor and the starving, and if you look at the one thing that, and so there's lots of policy based on the idea that the poor have to be the starving. One thing that people don't seem to notice is that the poor don't behave as if they're starving. So you give them an extra $1, they spend most of that on things other than, whatever, the banana or the boiled egg that's going to give them the maximum nutrition. That's not what they want. And I think that part of I don't think the point about complexity is policy paralysis. I think I think you're exactly right in raising that question. I think the point about it is that we shouldn't make policy at home without checking with the world, and I think we all too often do. It was a very nice example I just heard. In one of the states of India, they made up a policy that every child will be weighed. And they made they made teams of 5 people per district to do that. And somebody did a simple calculation, which nobody had done, which is that if you just take the number of children, divide by the number of people who are there checking them, it would take them, would have to have at least 2,400 minutes per day to do it, and there aren't 2,400 minutes a day. So just policies are made without almost any regard to the reality they're supposed to impact, and then of course they don't work.
And sometimes people don't want to know. I mean, you both, Jeff and Abhijit, have found that poor people don't always do the right thing. That you need to give free movie passes to get parents to sign up their kids for some of your programs. You found that if free cell phone minutes are added to people's cell phones in Pakistan, they might be more likely to take preventive medicines. Once you're there, it doesn't give the world the right picture. It gives a picture of people who are actually not helping themselves, and maybe people helping poor people or writing about doing policy work don't want to know that because it doesn't really help their cause.
Well, I think this idea of being a slave to a strategy, even when the evidence on the ground suggests the strategy is not working, right, happens all the time, right? That you're going to do something, it doesn't work, doesn't make any sense, and no one feels like, you know what, we shouldn't keep doing this. Sometimes people keep doing it for generations. It's absolutely stunning to me that in our business, innovation happens so slowly and people are so upset at failure, right? So you do something and it fails, and then people say, well, you can't do anything for those people, just give up. And I just remind people, failure sometimes leads to great inventions. I mean, no one wants to remember the Palm Pilot, which people told me if I got that was going to be, that was going to solve. Now, did they just stop trying to make devices because the Palm Pilot didn't work? No, they improved. In our business, you get a Palm Pilot, it's over. They say, don't do it, it doesn't work, throw in the towel. Instead of someone saying, okay, let's figure out why this didn't work, let's tweak it, let's understand the local conditions and make a better product, right? So I think that's what real live people find, right? That there's an interaction between real people and policy, that you've got to adjust the policies, which people often don't want to do.
It's worse than that. They get very in Poverty Action Lab. That's what we do for a living. Is just evaluate policies, and sometimes we find they don't work. Like microcredit is one of our, and we got called names from every possible side, right, left, center, behind. There's no side that liked that answer.
Right here.
Hi, I'm starting a book club at Kipps Junior High School in the Bronx in a couple weeks, and and for people in the audience who don't know, every student there is poor and every student there is not white. And I know I'm being naive by thinking I can make a difference, yet at the same time I believe we all have to feel we can make a difference. And I was wondering, Jeff, or anyone in the audience, if you could tell me what you think I should do aside from trying to further the kids' love of literature and aside from giving them healthy yet good-tasting snacks.
There was a piece, it may have been in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times today, that talked about the kids throwing all of the healthy stuff in the garbage, right? All of the healthy food, right? So, and I'm one of those healthy food people, and this is where reality steps in to the best social thinking, and you've got to make adjustments. So, you know I love KIPP. And what you all are doing. And I always say to folk that, none of this work is easy. And when you run up against, real children with real issues who may or may not love the fact that we are trying to save them, you should not lose hope, right? Because the kids don't immediately embrace whatever we think is going to be helpful for them, which I think is one of the big challenges with educators. This is what I found. I've told my kids the truth. I've tried to not then say I told you so when they mess up, right? Because they mess up. And I have found in the end it takes kids a while before they come to the realization that maybe you knew a little bit about what you were trying to give them. These ideas of experiences, of introducing young people to different points of view, I think is absolutely critical. Because these kids get trapped in their own environments, which has the own logic and the physics of that community they think is universal, and it's really just based on the South Bronx or based on in Harlem. And you want to give kids an opportunity to see others. So I just think none of this stuff is easy. None of it happens fast. In the end, things you think kids never listen to when you're my age, they come back and they tell you, thank you. Sometimes it's years later they say, thank you. You know what? You told me what to do. I didn't listen. This happened. I did what you told me. My life is different. And so at that time, I thought I was failed with that kid. Right? I said, okay, chalk that one off. That one didn't work. So some of this is not apparent immediately.
Yes.
All right. Now, Jose, I believe you were arrested for driving with a license in Minnesota yesterday, and I know that obviously, you see.
I didn't know that.
and you see in Harlem, in the South Bronx, Jeff, lots of issues surrounding stop and frisk. So what I'm kind of wondering is the issue of reporting on marginalized peoples and poor people. It's not just a cultural difference between middle class and poor, but there's also government policy and government policies that serve to kind of demonize and marginalize people. What impact does that play in understanding the experiences of marginalized peoples?
So I'm going to just, I originally when Bill Bratton was commissioner and we really started this real aggressive policing, I was and remain an advocate of a more restrained response, because I think if a young person's only interaction with law enforcement is this sort of just random stop, and people think stop and frisk is just, excuse me, can I pat you down for a second, nice young man? And that is not what this is at all. This is humiliating, it's degrading, and it's emasculating, intentionally. And if you're 16 and you have this man talking to you in ways that all of us would cringe, it changes the relationship you have with your society and your community. And that's the bad stuff. And I've been trying to say, yes, we need to, it's not like we don't need to make sure that we are preventing young people from carrying guns because the death rate has really been reduced dramatically, and that's important. But this idea that you can have a universal experience of African American and mostly Latino men being degraded by police officers, which will stay with them for the rest of their lives, is something that I think is appalling. And so somehow you have to sort of minimize this context. Let me say one other thing, and this is where it gets insidious. So this is the law. If a police officer stops you and you've got marijuana in your pocket, right? You've got 2 joints. And the police officer pats you down, finds the marijuana. That's a death ticket, right? It's the same as a parking fine. If the police officer says to you, what do you have in your pockets? Take it out. And you take out the marijuana, that's public display of drugs, and now you get arrested, right? And you go through the system. Now I tell folk, if you lined up 1,000 white kids, right? Guess what you're going to find? You're going to find, because whites smoke marijuana actually more than blacks. They would never allow that to happen. Right? They might say, what are you doing? You're arresting all these white kids, sending them into the system, and the kids have done nothing wrong. You could do it at any college or university in America, right? You would never allow that to happen because it's just bad for kids. So the fact that this happens in the black community is driving this whole, so once you get in the system, right, then now you're a number, you're a mugshot, you've got your first arrest, you're on your way. And when you do that to 70, 80% of a group, that is really something that I think is intolerable. So it's complicated because stop and frisk actually reduces the number of guns, which reduces the homicides, which stops my kids from being killed. So that's real. This other universal experience is so damaging to young people in this city that I think we've got to strike a different balance. And I said that to both the mayor and to the police commissioner.
Jose, do you want to say something about it? We didn't.
I can't really
that.
comment on what happened yesterday. I'm just really glad to be here. Let's put it that way. But what I can comment on is, I realized I was undocumented when I was 16. And I remember actually I went on Lou Dobbs a couple of months ago, just to tell him to his face that, sir, whenever you use that word illegal, I want you to think of all the kids sitting across the country listening to you say that, and what that does to people, the way they think about the fact that you're walking around, when I was 16, which was like, 15 years ago now, my relationship, like whenever I saw a cop, I remember being in Philadelphia. My first internship was at the Philadelphia Daily News covering homicides. And at that point, I didn't have a driver's license yet. And I just basically hitchhiked and took SEPTA, which is the subway system, to get to homicide, crime scenes. And it was the surreal nature of being the reporter covering homicides and dealing with cops, and the whole time being very like, I've always been, even now, going through TSA, like I don't even have the words to describe to you, like the knot in my stomach as I'm like in line. And I look like this. I can only imagine what happens to people who look, who look like Jose Antonio Vargas, who looks brown. And, that people would think that they may, one of the people that I've been following, I'm doing a documentary, one of the people I've been following is a kid named Victor. Grew up in Alabama, crossed the border when he was 5 or 6. He's now early 20s. And we did a cover photograph for Time magazine a few months ago, 3 months ago now. And it was the first time he flew, the first time he got on a plane. And we were all worried, and I was on the phone with him because he was like, he'd never been through TSA before. So I'm coaching him how to get through TSA without really the proper document to get through TSA. And telling him that you show the passport, you just open it, don't shake your hand, just don't shake. Just act like you're a student. Make sure you have a backpack on with a computer on it, so you take that out like you're a student. And when you pass through, because you're going to pass through, everything's going to be fine. Just don't smile. Appear like it's just the most normal thing you had done. And then when he got here, he showed us, he put the phone number of his lawyer under his sleeves.
We have time for one more question, and it's yours.
George, I was thinking about the piece you wrote last fall about the man who came to New York from Seattle when considering sort of the ambiguous title of the panel, and just wondering what anyone thought that the Occupy movements do or don't have to do with the issues we've been considering here.
Good question.
Thanks.
And the last. One of you want to take that one?
I'm happy to talk about anything, so I'll get into Occupy in a second, but I want to go down to folk who maybe actually know what they're talking about.
Actually, I think George, you're the one who should talk about it because I wasn't in the United States at the time, and so.
I mean, Occupy was a comet across the landscape. It was a mercurial thing. You felt it whenever you went to Zuccotti Park, that it wasn't going to last in that form, but it had crystallized and concentrated a tremendous amount of experience and feeling across the country. I used to spend hours on this website, We Are the 99%. It was a Tumblr blog that was people posting their picture and their story, and it was this outpouring of a sense that things are, as someone had, there were some great signs at Occupy, and one of them was something is wrong, and that one, to me, was the most eloquent. People had different ideas about what that something was, and very different ideas about what could be done about it. Something is wrong, and that is the heart of the work that all four of you do. And I was going to ask you, we don't have time to get the answers, but I was going to ask you, what keeps you doing it when it is so difficult? It is the hardest work. And the sense that something is wrong, if that sense won't let you alone, you will keep doing the work. And I think Occupy has faded. I think it's had its moment. And at the time, I never expected it to turn into any kind of organization or anything. I didn't think it would become a mass movement. I think what it did was held up a sign that said something is wrong. And that's an incredibly important thing. It changed the way people talk and think. It brought out into the open what many millions of people in their private lives had experienced and felt. And so do the four of you. So that sets me up to thank you all, not just for being here and for giving us this incredibly good conversation, but for what you do in your work. And one more thing, I forgot to tell you, if you tweet, use hashtag NYERFest. Thank you all for coming.